All right, welcome back, everyone. We all know that immigration law is very demanding with tight deadlines, high stakes cases, and constant regulatory changes. To serve your clients effectively in these conditions, you need to take care of yourself first. That's exactly what this session is about, how prioritizing your own mental and physical well being can help you be a better attorney and colleague. For this session, we're fortunate to be joined by Danielle Hall. Danielle is the Chief of Professionalism and Outreach for the Kansas Office of Judicial Administration and has spent her career helping legal professionals navigate the connection between well being, law practice management, and ethics. She's also the president of the Institute for Well-Being in Law and was named a Woman of Legal Tech honoree in 2023 by the ABA. Danielle's expertise in lawyer wellness, stress management, and ethical decision making makes her the perfect person to guide us through this important topic. Danielle will explore the biggest well being challenges immigration attorneys face, like compassion fatigue, burnout, and the pressure of running a practice, along with practical strategies to help you find balance. Take it away, Danielle. Thank you so much, and welcome to the summit.
All right. Well, thank you for quite the introduction. I am honored to be here with you today to talk about a topic that I feel is especially important to those of us that are in the legal profession, and especially right now. I told my husband last night, I feel this immense responsibility to come to you today and to give you some practical strategies and advice in order how to protect your own wellness. I think the title is perfect, and that way that you can protect your own wellness in order to continue to serve your clients that you serve. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the slides. Okay, so whenever I do my programs, I always love to give you an agenda so that way you know by the time that we're done what it is that we will have talked about. And I think it's important today that we spend just a little bit of time talking about why well-being is important in the legal profession, and more specifically for immigration practitioners. It was mentioned in my introduction, we all know that there are tight deadlines, there are specific circumstances in which immigration lawyers face that may bring you some added stress, may even put you at more risk for things like burnout, for instance. So we will talk about some of that. And then we're going to identify some of the key challenges that many of you may relate to in order to take care of your own well-being. And then lastly, give you those practical strategies. I want to start off first with the data, though. Many of you might have seen the data. We've been talking about it for the last several years, since 2016, given the study that was conducted by the Betty Ford Foundation, along with the Commission on Lawyers Assistance Programs. And in this study in 2016, it was pretty prevalent of the fact that lawyers by far suffered from higher rates of mental health conditions as well as substance use disorder. Since then, several other studies have been conducted by numerous organizations, even state studies have been conducted. And what we continue to see is the same sort of thing. The high rates of mental health conditions, including anxiety, depression, burnout, as well as high rates of substance use. But in addition to that, what we've seen in the last couple of years is some new statistics surrounding how lawyers are really starting at times to question whether or not they want to even continue to be lawyers. Given this data, I think it's important that we also talk about how it is that we change whatever is going on in our legal culture in order to better take care of ourselves. And I think when we look at the data compared with the National Task Force for Lawyer Wellbeing's report, which came out after that 2016 report and really gave us over 40 recommendations on how to, one, take care of ourselves, but two, I think more importantly, as lawyers, and then as well as judges, bar associations, organizations that have a stake in the legal profession, how we can really change the culture in order to improve overall well-being within the profession. So if you haven't taken a look at that report, I highly recommend it. It's got several recommendations that I think are key in order to reducing the stigma associated with mental health conditions and substance use disorder and wellness issues, along with how do we change that culture and make a positive impact. Within that report itself, what was interesting is the question as to why. Why should we care about these issues? Well, I think the data points us to a why, right? It's clear that we have the numbers out there that would suggest that this is a significant enough issue that we should definitely do something about it. But the other aspect of this is, if you think about it, is our professional obligations in order to really think about how we take care of ourselves to better take care of others. If you think, for instance, about our rules of professional conduct, our rules on competence, our rules on diligence, even our supervisory rules that we have, like Rule 5.3. These rules can be really key when we begin to look at issues surrounding well-being related circumstances. So, it was mentioned my role that I have currently within our Office of Judicial Administration in my state. But prior to that, for several years, I prosecuted attorney misconduct cases. And what I can tell you is I have seen this correlation between our duties to our clients, and then how does our wellness factor into that? And what does that look like? And when we look at something like competence, for instance, so Rule 1.1, our foundational rule, that we have to have the requisite knowledge and experience in order to represent our clients, one might say on face value, how does that relate back to our wellness? Well, I have seen it over and over again, time and time and time, where maybe somebody might be struggling with their own well being. And then that might start impacting them in their daily tasks and activities, even those associated with what we do as lawyers. I've seen missed deadlines as a result of somebody who may not be taking care of themselves, who may be burned out, who might not recognize it. And sometimes it becomes this downward spiral, so to speak. So we have this professional obligation, for what it's worth, in my opinion. So take that with a grain of salt. But we really do have this professional obligation in order to take care of ourselves, to take care of others. But I also think there's this aspect of civility and well being that can easily be connected. Think about the last time maybe you had a bad day. I always talk about this from a personal perspective first, right? Like when I have a bad day and I go home, maybe I take it out on my husband, maybe I take it out on my kids, whatever it might be, right? I don't intend to, but sometimes that happens. Well, we can also see this in the profession, right? When we think about lawyers who maybe are not very civil in nature, who maybe show up to the courtroom and who are very combative. Through my work at the Lawyers Assistance Program in our state, I often ask the question, if we have a lawyer who is exhibiting that behavior, what's going on underneath it all? Because at the end of the day, I like to say, we all bring our buckets to work, right? We never leave our bucket behind. And our bucket is everything that we have going on in our lives, whether that's personally, whether that's professionally, that can impact our overall wellness. And then you add the stress factor combined with that of what we do as a profession. So we can see this civility issue as maybe being impacted. So I already mentioned that when I was prosecuting disciplinary cases, I very much saw this connection between lawyer well-being, lawyer discipline, but also, as a side note, that law practice management aspect, right? If I don't have good business practices in place and I'm not very organized, which may increase my stress level in a profession where I'm already at risk for stress and burnout, and then I begin to experience maybe some stress, some anxiety, and I start walking down that path of burnout, which maybe then gets me to a point where I'm not being diligent. I'm not really exercising my competence because my judgment is skewed. And now maybe I have a lawyer disciplinary case. This cycle can work in several different directions, and I've seen it multiple times. But I also see this connection between stress and our productivity. If you think about the last time you were stressed and how that might have impacted you. Now, I'm not here to say that all stress is bad, because there is good stress, right? There's the stress that might motivate us, might get us to the point where we have tons of energy and we're going to meet a deadline. And that maybe gives us that boost to get over the hump, to get things done. That might be an example of good stress for somebody. But for somebody else, it might look different. It might look like I have way too much on my plate. I can't balance it all. And therefore, instead of increasing my productivity, what happens is that I run out of energy and I'm not as productive. I briefly want to talk to you about the difference between burnout and stress because you've heard me say burnout probably now 20 times in the 10 minutes I've had with you thus far. The reason why I talk about burnout a lot is because one, I've had my own experience being a practitioner and feeling the stages of burnout and deciding to maybe go a different path in what I was doing. But I've also assisted other lawyers who have experienced this concept of burnout. And all of the studies, all of the research that's out there suggests that we are at risk as lawyers. And so I want to describe to you the difference between the two so that way you know the difference between this is me stressed versus this is me burned out. So you'll see there on the screen, I'm not going to go through all of it, but you'll see that stress is really characterized a lot differently than what burnout is. While stress causes emotions to be reactive, while we're often hyperactive with stress, while maybe we get really overly engaged when we are stressed, burnout is the exact opposite. We're disengaged. Our emotions are blunted. Our motivation just isn't there, right? And it can really lead to things like feeling really detached from who you are as a lawyer and what you do as a lawyer. And it can also lead to things like depression and anxiety and a number of other mental health conditions. I'm here to tell you that burnout doesn't happen overnight. It is a slow build. That good stress or that eustress that we want to be in for optimal performance is a lot different than the distress that we might be constantly plagued with within our practice. And the thing about when we start experiencing distress or that bad stress is that there has to be peaks and valleys within that stress for it to be healthy and for us to maintain our productivity, our mental capacity, our competency, even maybe. So if we don't have those peaks and valleys and we are on this constant heightened line of stress, what ends up happening is we get physically impacted, we get mentally impacted, and then that's eventually what leads us to that stage of burnout. With no peak and valley in your stress, essentially what happens is you are in a constant state of fight or flight. When you are in a constant state of fight or flight, right, that's when our bodies begin to react, whether it's psychologically, whether it's physically, whether it's mentally. And eventually, we run out of that energy to do what we need to do. So I mentioned that as lawyers, we are at high risk for things like burnout. Well, then what makes us vulnerable? I feel like sometimes when I ask this question, I'm like, okay, maybe this might be a dumb question because each and every one of you can probably tell me what makes us vulnerable in this profession. Oftentimes, it relates back to that stressful characteristics of the job. The time pressures that we mentioned, work overload, right? Competition, right? I got to keep my business up. I got to keep them coming through the door. Maybe it's just simply dealing with difficult people or difficult times. Right now, for immigration lawyers, I think it's safe for me to say it might be difficult times, maybe feeling constantly attacked. That adds significantly to the stressful characteristics of the job that you do as immigration practitioners. And when we get into the specifics, we look at things like how you're often plagued with heavy caseloads, tight deadlines. Maybe you have emotional toll of client stories, for instance. Uncertainty right now on changing laws, changing policies. And I hope that in me bringing this to the forefront, that I'm not sitting here, right, causing you more stress. Because I think it's important that we talk about it, because we talk about it in order to figure out, okay, how do we deal with it? And then how do we set you up for success in responding to some of these things that put us at high risk and some of the stressful characteristics specifically related to your practice. On top of that, we really have to take a look at also the difference between the type of practice you have, whether it's you're a sole practitioner or maybe you're a large firm practitioner. You may be dealing with different characteristics of the job that can also have a significant impact. For instance, solo and small firm folks, things like isolation. Maybe it's the financial pressures of constantly having to bring business in through the door. Maybe it's managing all of your clients, given the fact that you have a high caseload. Maybe we're not utilizing technology in the best of ways that we could in order to assist us with that case management when maybe we don't have the physical people there to assist with it. From a large firm perspective, looking and talking about things like our billable hour pressures. Maybe you are responsible for being in a leadership position. So you're looking at, how do I juggle representing my clients, doing my own legal work, along with team management and leadership stress that sometimes comes along with it. So I go back to this question of what can then we do about it? Well, there's, I think, two different paths that we need to look at. Those of us as individuals, we have a responsibility as individuals to determine what works best for me and my own wellness and taking care of myself. And then organizationally, so this may be a management perspective for those of you that are in the large firms. What is it that you can do to set your teams up for success in ensuring that you are creating a culture and environment in order for well-being to thrive? And then I think of this concept of organizationally as the bigger, broader bubble from the profession perspective. What is it that we all can do as the large group of being a part of this profession to change the culture? So those are some of the things that I want to address with you. Here are some recommendations that I think we got to start with. Building awareness of our stress, right? Figuring out what are our feelings, what are our triggers, what are the things that we need to be aware of. The reason why I say we start here in assessing our own individual wellness capacity is specifically for the fact that if we don't know what stresses us, if we don't recognize our triggers, we're never going to realize that we are in this constant fight or flight mode. So learn how to recognize your signs that you are being pushed to the edge. So if you think about your physical response to stress, whether it's you get the tension headaches, whether maybe you find yourself being more irritable during times of stress, maybe it's the tension in your shoulders, whatever it might be, start becoming more aware of what it is. And then try to precisely decide what is indeed stressing you. If I am feeling, I'm getting the triggers in my body, because what happens when we are in fight or flight mode, when we are stressed, is our body is giving us indicators. Those are our red flags that are waving, telling us that we are stressed. So if those indicators are going on, I have to ask myself, what is the exact cause of what it is that I'm experiencing? And then I want you to figure out and evaluate, how are you coping with your stress? What is it that you're doing in response? Is it maladaptive? Is it bad behavior in response to stress? Or are we doing something more positive in nature to directly deal with the stress? What we are trying to do after we assess our triggers, our emotions, our body's physical response, is then we want to start asking ourselves, how can we build our resiliency? So when we talk about resiliency, what we're talking about is our ability to bounce back from difficult situations, our circumstances, with the least amount of impact to our physical health, our mental health, our psychological health. We just want to come out of it with the least amount of damage possible. When we work to build our resiliency, because as a response to building your resiliency, you'll be implementing things that will help you better manage stress and be a better response to your own wellness. So when we build our resiliency, there are several key areas. First recommendation is to strengthen your mindset. Then we want to develop our strong connections. We want to go back to that emotional regulation aspect. How am I responding to things in time of stress? And am I doing it in a healthy way? Of course, we want to maintain that physical and mental wellness. So we're going to talk about that too. It becomes very important in your resiliency skills to have a sense of purpose, and then figure out, how can I be more adaptable in situations? So let's go through some of my key sort of recommendations that I think may be helpful for you in dealing with stress response. So for those of us that dwell on circumstances, I'm going to raise my hand high here and tell on myself. I often do that in these programs. So you know where I'm coming from with this, is that I struggle with this. I dwell on circumstances all the time, and I'm constantly working on building my resiliency in this area. So then what are some things that we can do for those of us that then ruminate on circumstances? Well, there's a quick activity that you can do because I try to give you things that are super simple that you can implement within your day and only take a couple of minutes. So I'm going to ask you if you want to do this along with me right now. I know it's kind of odd, we're in a virtual environment, but I want to make this as very interactive as possible with you. So I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to do it along with you. I want you to draw a line down the center of a piece of paper. So on one side, I want you to write things I can control. And then on the other side of that column or that line, I want you to write things I cannot control. So I'm going to give you just a few seconds because we got a lot to cover today, but I want to give you an example of how to do this. So I want you to start first on the side of things that you cannot control. Don't start on the side of things that you can. Start on the side of the things that you cannot control. I'm going to give you just a quick 10 seconds. I want you to think about a situation or circumstance that has been plaguing you, that you have been dwelling on, that you've been ruminating on, and I want you to write down everything that you can control. Go. Okay, put your pen down. That was 10 seconds, very fast. On the other side now, I want you to think about the things that you can control. Now, these are not the things that you can say or do to change somebody else's mind or somebody else's opinion. These are the actual things that you can do and you can control in the situation. So they are mostly the things that what can I do in this situation or circumstance? I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Go. Okay, stop. So 10 seconds is not a lot of time, but I think it gives you a good idea of how to do this quick activity. If I had to guess, if I were a betting woman, the things that you cannot control, that list is probably a lot longer, even in 10 seconds, than on the other side of the things that you can control. So what happens with this activity is you give yourself longer, right? You give yourself a minute, 2 minutes, 30 seconds, however long you need to write everything down on both columns. And then I want you to circle the column of everything that you can control. Those are the things that you are going to fix your energy and your thoughts on. And what ends up happening when you do this type of activity, and if you truly invest in it and you run with it, what will end up happening is, and research supports this, no matter what happens in the situation or circumstance, you will end up being much happier about how you handled things in that situation because you focused your energy, you reduced your stress, and overall had a better response. And it should hopefully help with the dwelling as well, because there's only so many things that you can do, and we block out everything else that we cannot control. The other thing you can do if you ruminate on situations or circumstances is walk through the scenario. I recently received this advice from a clinician. I go to therapy, right? I work on myself as well. And this was a recommendation she gave me. So instead of trying to shut it off in your mind, instead of having all of the negative thoughts associated with it, instead think about, think it through. What would I feel if this situation happened of the worst of the worst? Because that's a tendency where our mind goes, right? And then how would I feel and who would be my support system? Because it's extremely important in building our resiliency. We want to identify the people that would be supportive to us. So once we do that, we walk through the situation, we're prepared now for the worst of the worst scenario when we really get down to brass tacks and we ask ourselves these two questions. Essentially, what should then happen is you should have the ability to then let go because you are prepared to deal with the worst of the worst. The other thing I want to briefly talk about is bringing things home with us. A lot of us do this. Some things that you can do: switch off between on mode of work and off work modes. Have something that's a ritual, a conscious process that takes place every single day, whether that's shutting the laptop screen, whether that is turning off the lights and shutting your office door, whatever it might be, make it be a ritual. The reason being is the brain works in really interesting ways, and the physical act of shutting off between off mode and on mode with work, what ends up happening is that it allows the brain to accept that as it is now time to stop and to move on to something else. If you work from home, it becomes really key if you are a remote worker to have a separate space for your workspace so that way you can still make this a conscious physical activity of shutting off for the day. The other thing you can do a brain dump. If you bring all of the stuff in your mind home with you, take the last 10 minutes of the day, write down very quickly anything and everything that you're thinking about, whether this is the things I have to do tomorrow, this is what I didn't get done today. Oh my goodness, I just need to jot this thought down. The idea behind this is then you come back to it tomorrow and it will be there, and you're not sitting there thinking about it at 3 in the morning. The other thing we can do to build our resiliency is we can practice gratitude. There's so much research out there to support the fact that practicing gratitude really helps us with our overall wellness and well-being. And simply just writing down in the evening or first thing in the morning, one thing you're grateful for in that day can help you immensely get through the rest of your day. The other thing I'm going to ask you to do is practice some self-compassion. Cross-examine your thinking when you're having all those negative thoughts. Is this really true what I'm thinking? Is this what I would say to a friend in this situation? Oftentimes, we are much more pleasant and kind to others than we are to ourselves when we are dealing with things that may be stressful in nature or things that are causing us pause or worry and figuring out on how to respond to them. Finding purpose and meaning. Once again, the research and data on this is significant when it comes to getting through stressful situations and circumstances. If we have a purpose in our life and a purpose in the work that we're doing, we are better off emotionally to have recovery from stress. It helps us build that resilience. Those of us that have that strong sense of purpose, we tend to have an increased mental health and overall well-being. So I want you to ask yourself this question of what sustains you in your work. Please jot that question down. If you immediately have the answer, jot it down on a sticky note, on a piece of paper, whatever it might be. And on those tough, stressful days, pull it out of your desk or look at the sticky note that you have attached to your computer screen and let that be the reminder of why it is that you're doing what it is that you're doing. You're finding passion within your work. Another thing I want to encourage you as individuals is to practice self-care. Self-care truly is the path to resilience. Things like prioritizing our sleep. The connection between sleep and mental health is tremendous. If I am dealing with anxiety, it's important that I get sleep because if I don't get sleep, it can increase my feelings of anxiousness and vice versa. So sleep becomes extremely important, both for our mental health and for our physical health as well. Doing things like making smart eating choices. I'm not going to tell you don't eat the bag of cookies, right? Sometimes we need to, but be smarter in our choices, right? Be more meaningful and mindful maybe in our eating habits. For those of you that don't eat lunch, eat lunch. You have to have that substance in order to then have the energy throughout your day. Of course, implementing physical activities. Those are the three basic things that I think all of us are like, yes, I know that. Sleep is important. Eating is important. Getting activity is important. I think the hard part of it is ensuring that we're doing it. So even if you have to calendar it within your day, then calendar it on your calendar and make an appointment with yourself to do it. Commit to taking those breaks. Do things like pray, meditate, relax in order to increase our overall spiritual wellness. Simply using things like breathing exercises. This is one that has worked tremendously for me in times of stress or nervousness or worry. So if you got to use it in the middle of a courtroom, you can. And it's called box breathing. It's a super simple process. You breathe in for 4 counts, hold it for 4 counts, release for 4 counts, and hold that release for 4 counts. So if you're interested in learning how to do this, YouTube it. You can find videos out there, and it really does help to slow the breath down, slow the heart rate down. And you know what's great about breathing in stressful situations is nobody's going to realize you're doing it because we all have to breathe. Make sure you're staying connected. You have a social circle. If you are a solo practitioner, this becomes extremely important, getting out there, networking, having social connections. Things like volunteering for causes that matter to you outside of your job can also be really impactful for our wellness. Things like learning something new, whether that's reading a book, for instance, on a different topic. And then, of course, time management strategies. From a law practice management well-being connection standpoint, to me, this becomes really important because if we can implement time management strategies to work more efficiently, get organized, then that has to have a positive benefit to our overall stress and our overall ability to have work-life balance. Doing things like setting boundaries can become important. What do your boundaries look like with work? What do they look like with your clients? I often say boundaries fit into two separate categories: our client boundaries and our self imposed boundaries. So, our client boundaries are those expectations in the representation. And let me tell you, a key tool is, of course, your attorney representation agreement can be a great tool to utilize in order to set boundaries. Our self-imposed boundaries, on the other hand, are the promises that we make to ourselves. This is, I'm not going to check my email while I'm on vacation, or I'm not going to check it after 6:00 p.m. Whatever those self-imposed boundaries are that we must make with ourselves and remind ourselves to do in order to keep our boundaries with work and clients. So some examples of some boundaries to think about. What are the types of communication channels you'll use with clients? How often do clients expect communication? How long will it take for a response? Also, what do we expect from our clients? Because that's the purposes of boundaries, and particularly the representation agreement, utilizing that as a tool, is it works both ways. What are our expectations for them as well in order for us to do our job successfully? Thinking about your appointments, your meeting times. Are they going to be during hours, after hours? Will you take scheduled appointments? Do you allow the client to pop in even though they don't have an appointment? And even thinking about things like back-to-back meetings, particularly virtual meetings. So Zoom gloom is a thing. If you have ever felt fatigued as a result of being on your computer screen all day long, what you are experiencing is true. It is a fatigue that occurs. So my tip for this is it's called the 20-20 method. So take 20 seconds, look at something 20 feet away. And essentially what happens is when you look at something that's not on screen for 20 seconds, that's 20 feet away, what'll happen is it just allows your eyes to refocus and your brain to refocus when you come back on the screen, which can also help with the ability to pay attention when you're feeling that Zoom gloom or Zoom fatigue. So I've already mentioned the tools. The attorney-client contract is a big one to set boundaries, your welcome packet, if you have an initial meeting with a client, even firm policies and procedures. There's a local firm here in my state that I always use an example. One of their boundaries that is a firm policy and procedure is that Friday afternoons at noon, the office is quote unquote closed. It's not that the lawyers aren't working, it's that that's their time where they don't take client meetings, they don't take client phone calls. They've defined for their clients what constitutes an emergency to where they would, in those circumstances, take phone calls or meetings. But for the most part, that's their time to get the work done that they need to get done, to get caught up, and to get prepared for the next week. My materials have questions that you can ask yourself about your time in order to help you set your boundaries. If you haven't thought about this, I highly encourage you to do so. Okay, I'm going to check my clock here because I got a lot to talk about and a little bit of time left. But I want to talk with you about how do we then implement some more maybe time management stuff? Because when we are cognitively switching between this concept of deep work and shallow work, and deep work is really the work that we do as lawyers, it pushes us cognitively. Our shallow work, that's that rapid fire communication and the things that really interrupt us throughout our day. This cognitive switching drains your time, drains your energy, and guess what it also does? It can increase your stress. So as a result, what we want to do is we want to implement those time management techniques. Things like block scheduling or the Pomodoro technique, for instance, can be really helpful. So Pomodoro is one of my favorite ones. It's pretty simple. You get a timer, you set it for 25 minutes, you turn off all your push notifications and anything that may be that may impact your ability to focus, and you focus in on something that you are working on for that 25-minute period. Then you take a 5-minute break, reset your timer, go back, do another 25-minute increment. And after you've done 3 or 4 of these, take a longer 10 to 15 to 20-minute break, and then come back and set your timer again. Block scheduling, on the other hand, is kind of what it sounds like. I'm going to schedule blocks of time on my calendar for everything. I'm even going to have a block of time for chaos, right? Because I don't know what's going to be the unexpected thing that happens throughout my day. So I'm going to schedule some time to deal with those situations and circumstances. But then I'm also going to have time on my calendar to work on the things that I need to do, whether that is maybe it's a visa application, maybe it is something that you're filing within the immigration courts, but you're going to block that time out on your calendar, and your whole day is actually going to be blocked so you can get things done. So this is the Eisenhower matrix. I'm not going to go through much through this given the amount of time I have left, but this is another example of a time management tool that you can use. The idea behind this is you begin to prioritize what it is that you're working on based upon the urgency and the importance of that task. And then you have things like the ABCDE method, same kind of concept, ranks things by importance. And then, of course, work batching. So I'm going to group all of the things together that I'm doing that are alike, so my brain can focus on that task and it becomes repetitive so I can get it done more quickly. So I'm going to batch like tasks together. So a good example here is maybe responding to email. I'm going to respond to email for a specific amount of time. I'm going to batch all of that together and do it all at once. Eat that frog. That's the concept of the most difficult thing, my most difficult task I'm going to tackle first thing in the morning. Difficulty can be because of the actual difficulty of the knowledge that's involved, or maybe it's just difficult because I hate doing it. So I'm going to get it done first thing in the morning, and I'm going to get it off my plate. Procrastination management is a little bit different than time management. For those of you that may procrastinate, I fall into this category. So sometimes we have to do things a little bit differently in order to deal with procrastination. A big aspect of this, I call back to DBT therapy. Our cognitive behavioral therapy. There's this concept of my thoughts, emotions, and actions are based upon one another. And so what I mean by that is if I hate doing a particular task, I'm going to have thoughts about hating doing it, and it's going to cause me emotions. And once I feel those emotions, I don't want to feel negative emotions. I don't want to feel anxiety. I don't want to feel stress, pressure, overwhelm, whatever it might be. So instead, I procrastinate to not feel those emotions, to not have those negative thoughts, and I push the task off. So the biggest thing we can do with procrastination is to adjust the way that we think about it. So once we start having those negative thoughts, feelings, emotions, maybe it's a particular case that you're working on, what I want you to then think about instead is to flip how you think about it. And what I want you to do is I want you to start thinking positively about that task. So if it's a phone call you have to make that you don't want to make, right? What's the one positive thing if you make that phone call and you're feeling negatively about it? It's one less thing I have to do on my task list. So even if that is the one thing to focus on, switch it to a positive. Okay, I'm looking at my time here, and I want to make sure that we're going to have enough time for questions, and then, of course, get through a little bit of maybe potentially some of the rest of this. But a couple of things here. Just make sure you're managing your energy. But I do want to give some final kind of tips for solo practitioners versus our big firm practitioners who may be in leadership. So I keep going back to the isolation aspect for solo practitioners. I want you to think about building your support networks, your mentorship relationships, being involved in organizations. I think to a certain degree, even being involved in conferences that you're involved with, like the one we're on today, making connections, getting to even know people in a virtual environment can be extremely helpful and impactful for you. Managing those caseloads realistically, saying no without the guilt when you don't have the capacity to take on more. Here's the key advice for you if you struggle like me with saying no. It's called the Oreo method. What we do is we put 2 positives around the negative no. So if I got asked to do a program next week and I don't have the time or the mental capacity to do it, instead, what am I going to say? I am going to say, you know what? I am honored that you thought of me and you thought that I would be a good person, a good fit for this program. But at this time, I don't have enough time on my calendar to give this, so I'm going to have to say no. But if maybe next year you think of me and you think of a program that I could do, then please feel free to follow up with me so that way we can see if maybe we can work that out. Does nothing for the person on the receiving end. But what it does for me is it makes me feel better about saying no because I have said two positives in the way that I framed it. It's adjusting our thinking. And so I've got some questions here. I want to make sure that I get to some of them and I answer some of them. I have a question here. What are some examples for mentorship organizations? That is a good question. So some of the things that you want to think about, you want to look at your local organizations, whether that's your local bar associations, your specialty associations can also be really good for this. Things like ALA is really good to look at from a finding those connections and those mentorship capacities. But I encourage from the large firm perspective, ask yourself, do you have mentorship capabilities within your own organization? Are you setting those up? Are you utilizing those to the most effective way? I think some of the problems sometimes with mentorship relationships, especially when people are paired, is ensuring that those relationships are actually working and that people are following through with them. So if you have a program or you have even a program in your state where maybe you're struggling to figure out how to make it more meaningful, my suggestion is to put a little bit of structure in between that mentorship relationship. So what I mean by that is if there are activities, areas of focus, topics of suggestions that the mentor and the mentee can then have a conversation about, help guide that relationship so both parties get the most out of that particular relationship.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle, for all that amazing information. We do have some other questions that people put into our specific Q&A tab, if we can tackle those for a
Okay,
few
yeah.
minutes. So this question got a few upvotes. Do you have any advice for people who don't have a lot of free time between work, life, and family? They don't have time to do a lot of self-care. Any quick things they could do on a daily basis?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think as lawyers, we sometimes, I'll just say, make things more difficult than they have to be. I find that I do that myself. And it's really also about finding something that works for you as the individual. So I gave you the example of finding, it's really important that we find the time on our calendars, right? Even if it's 5 minutes, even if it's 10 minutes, I always say block it out. I've got a block on my calendar every morning, even before the beginning of the day, that I block out for my own time to exercise. That is what works for me, but may not work for somebody else. But implementing things like breaks throughout your day, whether it's 5 minutes. Some people don't think about that as self-care, but that truly is self-care in order to get that break, step away from your desk, get some air outside. Doing something as simple as that, believe it or not, can go a long way. So it doesn't always have to be mindfulness, meditation, and yoga and finding the time to exercise. Something as simple as taking a break or not eating lunch at your desk, eating lunch somewhere else can also help you in that self-care aspect. So thinking about it sometimes in the most simplest way possible may actually have the most benefits for you as the individual.
Absolutely. And since you just mentioned something important like taking breaks to eat lunch in another area, that's a great segue into another question. Do you recommend any resources for busy people to be healthier via exercise, better food choices, less bad choices like caffeine or alcohol?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do actually. So, one of the resources that I want to throw out there for you is the ABA, for instance, has a number of resources available. They have an individual toolkit. You'll see on my slides a link to that will give you some more additional resources in those areas. But even the Institute for Wellbeing and Law, which is the organization that I'm involved with, oftentimes we'll put out a lot of information and even do our own webinars and such on that. But looking for things that really work for you. And one thing that I tell folks is for the physical health stuff and getting some help in that regard for the self-care aspect of it, if you belong to a firm, for instance, The EAP is a wonderful resource oftentimes when it comes, even if you maybe shy away from going to it for your mental health. I know that even though we shouldn't have those concerns, there's still stigma associated with it. But figuring out what those resources are that maybe your EPA could even provide you, even in the physical health aspect, might be helpful.
Amazing, amazing. Um, and then also on that same note, as far as exercise go, people who are super busy, and this will tie into another question we got from Seth. Hey, Seth, we're going to see you tomorrow. I know a lot of our attendees probably just got through with a really busy H-1B cap season. And the question is, if you have to sacrifice something during a busy season with work, what would it be?
Oh gosh, if you have to sacrifice something during a busy season, what would it be? Oftentimes where I look at this is if I don't have the time to do my full regimen of self-care, for instance, still ensuring that I am getting at least something in for myself. So one interesting thing that I've been reading a lot on lately is the impact that even a simple walk can have on your physical health and your mental health. Even if it's just 10 to 15 minutes after you eat a meal, how that can help one with digestion, which sometimes it can be an issue as you're sitting there trying to work on things after you've ate your lunch, can help with digestion. It can help clear your mind. It can get you outside to get you in nature, get you a breath of fresh air. So I always say, find something, even if it's in a small segment of your day, even if you can't do your full regimen. I wouldn't sacrifice my self-care. That's kind of where I'm at this point in my life, with ensuring that I have the ability to then do the things that I need to do for others, of course, by doing things for myself.
And I think that's such an important point. Maybe if you can touch a little bit more on what a more busy person can do with their personal care. Obviously, you don't have to spend hours a day at the gym, etc. If you even just have 10 or 15 minutes, some different options of things that somebody can do to do something that's healthy and betters their well-being.
Absolutely. I mean, even if it's finding the one thing that you feel like is most beneficial and most impactful for you. When I say self-care stuff and I give examples, I always preface, it's not a one size fits all. What works for me might not work for you, might not work for somebody else, but may. And so it's finding, if we look at, for instance, the different areas of our wellness, because I think this is important when answering this question. So if we look at the dimensions of well-being, we've got 7 that we often talk about, 6 we talk about within the profession. So those are things like our mental well-being, our social well-being, our physical well-being, our occupational well-being, and our intellectual well-being. So we've got these 5 different categories, which all have things underneath them that we could do, right? Physical health, we know, right? Get up, move around, walk around, whether that's going to the gym, whatever. But even that social aspect, right? So even if it's participating in something like a networking event, and we go and there's some social aspects and connection to that, then that will increase your wellness in that area, which then has a benefit really to our overall wellness. So sometimes we don't think about some of those things that we may do for work, like a networking event. If we're really going and making those social connections, that can also be an aspect of wellness. So if there are things that you do within your professional and your personal life already, it may be just reframing your approach to those situations in order to receive more benefit out of them.
Amazing, amazing. Another question here for people who work in larger firms. Any comments or advice on how to maybe manage certain internal relationships where you feel pressure from the people above you, your superiors, who are demanding a lot of you in your job as a lawyer? How to handle that stress and time management in those relationships?
Yeah, that I think is an important one, right? And oftentimes when we talk about this concept of wellness from an organization or a large organization perspective, I often talk a lot about how top down
Mm.
makes a huge impact when it comes to overall wellness. So if you're in a situation or circumstance where you're feeling pushed to your limits, figuring out how to navigate, and one, what's your level of comfortability? I always say first with having the conversation. Because if you're feeling that way, my guess is there are probably more people in your organization that are also feeling that way. And so, I always encourage people, if you can, have the conversation about if you are on the verge of burnout, if it is too much, going to that leadership and expressing that opinion in some form or fashion is really going to be the way that we impact the culture and we begin to change it. Because if we all keep going along the same way, right, we're never going to have that impact. But sometimes that's not always doable. And I get that in certain work situations. So then it becomes the question of, what can then I do to respond to that? If that's just the nature of the beast that I work in, what are some of the things? I think the time management aspect that you mentioned is something that's going to be extremely important, ensuring that you're organized, looking into things that you can implement, some of the things that I talked about with some of the different techniques. But the other aspect of that is also, are you utilizing your resources to the best of its ability in order to reduce maybe some of the impact of that work? Sometimes we think we're doing the greatest job, for instance, with delegation, but maybe it's we're not really delegating and we don't understand the roles maybe within the organization and who can I delegate to. So that might be a question that you need to ask. Who's responsible for what? Is there support there that I could delegate some of these minor, what I would consider as a lawyer, minor tasks to, in order to get maybe some relief and some help?
Amazing, amazing. And we only have a few minutes left, so let's see if we can squeeze in a couple more questions. And this is a good segue. You mentioned in your last response the word burnout again. And the question here is, you mentioned during your presentation that burnout is a slow build. Can you touch on some warning signs that are there that people can then use to make changes before it's too late? What can be done about this before you kind of get to the end and are falling off that cliff?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we look at burnout and some of the big warning signs, we often talk about the big four. So if you are fatigued to the point where you get sleep and you're not feeling like you're getting any relief from it, that's a big red flag. If you're feeling cynical about everything, right? You don't get the small wins anymore. You're not getting enjoyment out of both your professional and personal lives at that point, combined with the inability to focus, right? I want to get my work done, but just for some reason, I can't focus in on it. And two, feeling like no matter how much you get done, you just don't have the ability to catch up. When we see that combination come together for an individual, that's often when most clinicians will say you might be either already burned out or are leaning towards that kind of area in which you're really at risk for burnout. So when you start feeling that type of way, you start seeing those things, and then you could even see things like impact your physical health, unexplained things, right? All of a sudden I'm having chest pains and I don't know why, and my doctor's telling me my heart is fine. Maybe time to talk to somebody. And that's the best thing that you can do in response to burnout, is really at that point in time seek help. Whether that is finding a clinician that you're comfortable working with, whether it's going to your EAP, whether it's finding a support system within leadership, within your organization, if there is somebody there that you can talk to. That's the important aspect of burnout. And then what I can tell you is that, just very briefly in the last kind of minute I have with you, is that if you're feeling like maybe I'm burned out, the best thing I can tell you is, if you can, this weekend, do nothing for me, please. Go home, tell your spouse and your kids you went to this conference and somebody who works in this area said you are not supposed to do anything this weekend. Put me in the middle of the situation. Don't do any work. Do things that enjoy you, that cause enjoyment in your life. Get caught up on your rest. And if on Sunday nights you're still dreading going to work on Monday, then I highly advise that maybe it's time to connect with somebody who might be able to help you in this area.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, everyone, you heard it here first. Danielle says, tell your spouse, take it easy this weekend. No cooking, no cleaning. Um, and in our last minute here, Danielle, one final question for you before we wrap it up. I know you did touch on this during your slides as well, but any practical tips to distance yourself from your clients' circumstances so it doesn't weigh on you? I guess an easier way to say, try not to bring your clients' problems home to your family once you shut down the computer, flip the light switch, and move out of the office.
Yeah, that's when I think that we probably all at some point within our careers have struggled with, right? There's always that one client or that one case that really weighs heavy on you. And I do think that there is, as was mentioned, some of the stuff in my slides can be extremely helpful, but I think it's also taking the time to do it, right? If I'm going to make the conscious process to cut off the end of my day. Doing it just once or twice a week is not going to put me in a pattern to really accept that I'm going to leave that stuff at home, at work, and I'm not going to bring it home. So if you're going to try doing things like implementing rituals to shut off the things, do that ritual every single day, so that way your body will have impact with it, and then your brain will begin to respond to it. That quick activity I did with you can be really helpful in the moment. But I also want to acknowledge, right, it's hard, and it's probably really hard right now for some of you, and just what we're seeing, what you're being impacted by. A lot of people tell us stay off of social media, stay off of don't watch the news, right? But sometimes it's hard when, to a certain degree, you almost feel like you have to in order to know what's going on for your clients. So we may have to think out of the box as immigration practitioners and how we respond to that stuff. And that's where implementing some of that stuff, like really try doing the brain dump, try, walking through the scenario of the worst or worst for your clients. So that way you can get through it, you can process it emotionally, and then hopefully you don't bring it home with you.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much, Danielle. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we really appreciate you joining us for such an important topic that many times might feel overlooked. But of course, our health and well-being is the most important thing. If we can't take care of ourselves, how can we function well in other aspects of our life? So we posted some information about Danielle in our chat if you'd like to reach out to her for any further conversation or resources on such an important topic. And thank you again, Danielle, for joining us today.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.